It's time to eat.
What are you hungry for?
Sit down and get ready to consume an abundance of fantasy football knowledge from Ross Tucker and John Daigle.
Feed me now. I'm starving.
On the Fantasy Feast Eatin' podcast.
Yeah, let's eat, baby. It is the Fantasy Feast Eatin' podcast. We are, of course, presented by DraftKings. The crown is yours. I'm Ross Tucker, former NFL offensive lineman, 5 teams, 7 years, long time ago. Most of you know that because you're regular listeners, or maybe you check us out on YouTube, youtube.com/Ross Tucker NFL, which is awesome. We are growing quickly over there. You can always check me out personally on social media if you're interested, at Ross Tucker NFL. We are at Ross Tucker Pod. Highly encourage you to follow both, to subscribe on YouTube, or subscribe wherever it is that you listen to this show. I do the Ross Tucker Football Podcast, which is 25 minutes or less with what's going on in the NFL, 3 days a week in the offseason. Even money, we never stop talking about betting on NFL games. That's weekly. College draft, it's an unbelievable time for the College Draft Podcast. We'll have Emory on Monday with a little bit of a combine recap. And then this is the Fantasy Feast with my guy, John Daigle, the information man from EstablishTheRun.com. Can't highly encourage you enough to do two things. Number one, follow John on social at NotJDaigle, and go to EstablishTheRun.com. They got Evan Silva, who a lot of you know from back in the day, Adam Levitan. Use the code FEAST. You get a discount on all of their information. Now, if you remember, we got some really exciting stuff coming up the next couple weeks as it relates to pre-free agency, post-free agency. Very, very critical to have an idea of what you think about the players themselves before we know their situation. And of course, after we know their situation, there'll be a lot more to discuss. But it's also super important, and we realized this last week, to know the coaching changes, to know what that means for the skill guys on those teams. Last week was the NFC, so if you missed that, go back and either listen or watch youtube.com/Ross Tucker NFL to our breakdown of what the coaching changes mean in the NFC. Now, today, John, we're moving on to the AFC. And as big as any is what's going on in Jacksonville, where, by the way, I feel like the last few years, there's always a lot of Jacksonville fantasy discussion, right? Whether it's Trevor Lawrence or Tank Bigsby and ETN or Evan Engram, or they always have like 5 receivers, it feels like, that are worth talking about. Gabe Davis and Christian Kirk, and where do these guys fit in? Well, now they also have a new brain trust. Not only is my buddy Tony Baselli the senior VP of football operations, and he helped hire James Gladstone as the GM, they have a new head coach in Liam Cohen and a new OC in Grant Udinkski. What I think is interesting, John, is that the Bucs really tried to keep Liam Cohen. They really thought highly of him, but ultimately the Jags could offer like 3 times the amount of money that the Bucs were offering, and so Cohen was gone.
And if there are any future head coaches, current coordinators listening, I think Cohen did the right approach in striking while the iron was hot for someone who wanted to be a head coach. It is going to be a collaborative process, though, between him and, as you mentioned, Grant Udinkski, who comes over from Minnesota. What's funny is that although the NFL is a handshaking mentality when it comes to coaching staffs, neither Cohen or Udinkski had previously worked together. But their coaching tree, their ideology, stems from Sean McVay and the Rams offense. That's where the connection is. Udinkski most recently helping Sam Darnold become a comeback player of the year candidate under Kevin O'Connell, who of course previously worked under Sean McVay, and then Liam Cohen, who was also previously an offensive assistant with the Rams, and most recently helped Baker Mayfield, as we mentioned in the NFC Coaching Change podcast, post career highs with 4,500 passing yards, 41 touchdowns, and a 71.5% completion rate just last year. For the offense and the pieces they're going to have at hand, we are monitoring what this team's going to do under a new regime, because Christian Kirk, as crazy as it sounds, does save the team $10.5 million if he's cut. And the same goes for Evan Ingram, who saves $6.5 million against the cap if he's released. And if that's the case, remember, over the last month of the season in particular, Brian Thomas Jr. in those 4 games finished as the overall wide receiver 1 in fantasy, ahead of Jamar Chase, Mike Evans, Amon-Ra St. Brown, the list goes on. And I would imagine this offense, regardless of if those players are still on the team in week 1, is still going to run through BTJ after his incredible rookie year.
Wow. Okay. So there's a couple things here. Number one, this is why I love doing this show with you, John. I didn't realize that Cohen and Udinkski never worked together before. That's really interesting. That doesn't happen very often, that a guy like Liam Cohen gets his dream job, gets a head coaching gig, and hires as an OC. Although Cohen's still going to call the plays, hires an OC that he's never worked with previously. You know, that would tell me that, man, Udinkski has a really good reputation for Cohen to make that move with that young man.
And I would imagine they're both in line and understanding the most important piece of that offense is not Brian Thomas, but Trevor Lawrence. After signing a big extension, that's the quarterback they're strapped to with so much promise, and honestly is underwhelmed to this point of his career for a variety of reasons. You can blame the second half of last season playing through multiple injuries for him, but I would think they are both aligned in saying this is the guy we have to get right and develop immediately to have a successful offense.
The other thing is, I knew Brian Thomas tore it up last year, and in particular, late in the year.
Yep.
I didn't know it was like that. What was that stat again? Over the last 4 games?
Over the last 4 games, neither Christian Kirk or Evan Ingram were available, and Thomas finished as the wide receiver 1 in that span in fantasy, ahead of Jamar Chase, who everyone thinks was the best wide receiver at that time.
Wow. That is something else. Anything in particular, John, watching Cohen with the Bucs, that bodes well for any other positions or any players? You know, we saw what Bucky Irving did. I don't know if you think that means anything for either one of the runners. You know, he's been very outspoken at the combine that the passing game is going to run through Brian Thomas Jr.
And Cohen showed he can utilize multiple backs and, more importantly, play the better one. And if we go based off simply last year's usage, Tank Bigsby was far more explosive than Travis Etienne was. So I would imagine that it's not only going to see both running backs involved in Jacksonville under Cohen, but right now, if you're doing early best ball drafts on DraftKings, Bigsby is still the value, because clearly if he's the hot hand, if he's the better player in camp, that's the player Cohen will utilize more.
Yeah, programming note, by the way. If your first son's name is Travis, don't name the second one Trevor. Like, we're trying to do a show here. I mean, what are we doing here? You know what I mean? Like, the whole point of a name is to differentiate one person from another. To have them be that close, people are going to make that mistake all the time. What are we doing here, John?
Amon-Ra and Equanimous are far enough apart. Let's strive for that more often.
Yeah. I mean, seriously, Travis and Trevor, I mean, come on, dude. People are going to make that mistake a million times if Trevor Etienne ends up being a really good player like Travis Etienne. That's not looking like a very good first-round pick, by the way, Travis Etienne.
But Bigsby, a clear bounce back sophomore year after he really struggled as a rookie.
All right, some of these other coaching changes. What about the Jets? Tanner Engstrand, you know, here's the deal. This is a situation where clearly Aaron Glenn was impressed by this guy and wanted to bring him. You know, that's the single biggest hire for Aaron Glenn for the rest of his life, you could argue, is he gets a head coaching gig and he needs an offensive coordinator. Who does he hire? He hires our guy, Tanner. And so now the question is, what do we know about him? What do we think about Tanner Engstrand?
Engstrand not only began his coaching career under Jim Harbaugh at San Diego back in 2011, but was also hired by Harbaugh as an offensive assistant down the road at Michigan several years later, and then worked with Ben Johnson in every season in Detroit. That's what also makes this hiring so important to the future of football, is that Engstrand is the first seed of the Ben Johnson coaching tree. And apparently, according to Aaron Glenn at press conferences during the combine, Engstrand was also the guy who came up with the plan on how to get all the players the ball in Detroit, and then Ben Johnson would call plays off of that. So apparently his brain work was already being used wisely in Detroit. The Jets are obviously going to have a different quarterback this year, and Garrett Wilson most likely as the wide receiver one, since Davante Adams is probably going to follow Aaron Rodgers wherever he ultimately lands in free agency. But we did see Garrett Wilson, unlike when Adams arrived, could be a wide receiver one in usage when he was that lone receiver because he's so talented. So I will be curious to see what they ultimately do at quarterback this year. But Garrett Wilson right now, you just have to forget about the stats in the second half of the season since we do not expect Adams to be playing alongside him.
What does the Engstrand hire mean for Breece Hall and Braylon Allen in your mind, John?
I prefer to continue leaning on Breece Hall as an RB1, but Braylon Allen was not only a terrific young prospect, he also showed he can be a sturdy running back if given those touches. He had issues getting carries early on under Robert Saleh, and then eventually was removed from the offense altogether until Breece Hall was injured whenever the Jets shuffled in Jeff Ulbrich as their interim head coach. But right now, I would think that it's still going to be Breece Hall as a fringe RB1 for fantasy. And then when he's injured, obviously, Braylon Allen is someone we can count on after that. I do wonder if it's going to be a committee approach. Maybe Engstrand will see that Braylon Allen is so talented that similar to Montgomery and Gibbs in Detroit, that they have to get both running backs involved.
You don't need to pay a fortune for your vodka. What I love about Smirnoff, world's #1 vodka without breaking the bank. I like to pair it with like Pedialyte or Gatorade Zero because then I'm getting hydrated while I'm getting a little vodka on. They still have all those awesome items at SmirnoffDrops.com. Again, that's SmirnoffDrops.com if you want to see those items, which are all just $12.99. Just like a bottle of Smirnoff. Please drink responsibly. Smirnoff number 21 vodka, distilled from grain, 40% alcohol by volume. The Smirnoff Company, New York, New York. Pricing is at the sole discretion of the retailer. May vary by state. Please do not share with anyone under legal drinking age. Smirnoff, we do game days. All right. This one, I feel like we should have a lot of knowledge about because we've seen it 2 other times. This has got to be, John, you're the information guy. He's got to be the first 3-time coordinator with the same team in NFL history. He's back. Josh McDaniels is back in New England. This time, he gets to work with Drake May, John.
And most people recall Josh McDaniels had have negative opinions on him, and rightfully so, because of his stint as a head coach. 20-33 as a head coach, and didn't make it through his second season in either stint with both the Broncos and the Raiders. But as strictly a play caller, I do have confidence in Josh McDaniels, a lot more than others. Recall in 2020, so his last 3 seasons that he actually completed as a coordinator, 7-9 with a quarterback in Cam Newton, who only threw for 8 touchdowns, but because Josh McDaniels instead built the offense around his strengths and allowed Cam Newton to lead that Patriots team in rush attempts and 12 scores from the ground. In 2021, the Patriots, with rookie Mac Jones under center for the entire year, finished 7th in points per game. And then in 2022, the Raiders finished 13th in points per game with Derek Carr and Jared Stidham. With Drake May under center, who I know it sounds crazy to say after Washington and Jaden McDaniels' run through the NFC Conference Championship game, but honestly, we are still in a situation where we can shuffle up those top 3 quarterbacks of last year's draft, Caleb Williams, Jaden Daniels, and Drake May, And it's still a debate who should be picked number one overall between them because Drake May was quietly that good for an offense that had questionable playmakers surrounding him. So I am actually excited for fantasy for Drake May and seeing what Josh McDaniels can do, assuming head coach Mike Vrabel is going to add significantly more players to this offense this offseason.
Okay, so you just said a couple interesting things there. Mm-hmm. You still are of the mindset, John, that you think it still would be debatable between those three guys who should be the number one pick?
I do, yes. As crazy as that sounds, I do, yes.
Wow. Like, you watched a lot of Jaden Daniels.
To be clear, this is not a detriment to Jaden Daniels. This is a compliment to everyone else because we saw Caleb Williams have the arm talent and escape the pocket and mobility. He just obviously was very inaccurate. I would imagine Ben Johnson helps mold that. And then Drake May, you watched Drake May. Drake May was very, very good given the offense around him. Jaden Daniels had the hot season, but can that flip in a situation where Daniels slightly goes down, becomes inefficient, and Drake May evolves as a passer? Of course. They were all three very, very, very good.
Got it. Yeah, I mean, in my mind, I would go Jaden Daniels, Drake May, Caleb Williams, based on what I've seen. Mm-hmm. But we'll see. What makes it interesting is that two of them have new coaches, new head coaches, and new coordinators that could make a significant difference. Speaking of new head coaches, new coordinators, obviously what we're doing. The Raiders have a new head coach in Pete Carroll and a new coordinator in Chip Kelly. Very interesting to me because that feels like a little bit of a misfit toy situation because Pete Carroll, I think about running the rock is what he wants to do, play defense. You know, I think Chip Kelly, up-tempo. He likes to run the ball, but I think up-tempo, hurry up. So I think that's an interesting pairing there with Chip Kelly and Pete Carroll. Your thoughts, John?
And our audience likely remembers Chip Kelly from his stint with the Eagles that ultimately ran out of gas for a number of reasons. But I would argue he has evolved immensely as a play caller since then. Still leaned on tempo, as you said. That's his bread and butter at UCLA. But also began implementing more play action and tight end usage since he does spread the offense out to go along with his base scheme in zone read, motion, and misdirection. And it's going to be interesting to see if the Raiders try to prioritize a mobile quarterback specifically early in the draft, because if so, we also saw that with Will Howard at Ohio State's national championship offense last year, Chip Kelly's also not afraid to lean into RPOs. And so with the Eagles, that offense felt hurried at that time. But with UCLA and Ohio State last year, I think those offenses were strategically paced to keep defenses guessing. And so, yes, it's going to lean on zone reads in the run. But how it builds off of that, I think Chip Kelly has learned how to do that with the correct personnel in place. It's just clear that the Raiders still have all the talent to build on this offense first and foremost.
As if I couldn't already love my dudes at Labatt enough, now you can get cool stuff for doing what you're going to do anyway. Drink beer. It's called Buy Beer, Get Gear from Labatt. Head to the website, snap a photo of your receipt, upload it instantly to rack up points for exclusive merch. How cool is this? You get points for every purchase at any store, bar, or stadium, any size, any product, anywhere you're buying Labatt. Buy beer, get gear. Go to rewards.labattusa.com to sign up. You know, I think it's really pretty interesting, too, when you think about like Chip Kelly and Will Howard. You know, like how much does Chip really believe in him? What does he think of him? Is he telling the Raiders, hey, I don't think we need to take a guy high or in the first round. Let's get Will in the second or third round, and I think he can do the job here. I mean, I'm not going to say he knows more than anybody else, but he obviously has a very strong opinion about Will Howard's ability to play at this level.
And it's exciting because, as you mentioned, Pete Carroll wants to do one thing, but we also saw in Seattle, he would only take over the reins on offense in his final couple of years whenever he thought the offense was getting out of hand. Otherwise, where Pete Carroll's strengths are is creating a culture for an organization and then allowing his coaches to do what they do. And so if it does get out of hand, if we run into the same wall that we previously hit when Chip Kelly had his last 2 stints in the NFL with San Francisco and Philadelphia, then yes, the Pete Carroll would step in. But I don't think we're at that point because, again, even in the interviews you've heard over the last couple of seasons, Chip Kelly, I think, has evolved as a person as well. So I am most interested to see where he's grown as a play caller now in his 3rd stint in the NFL.
I think it's interesting to see what they do skill position-wise, too. I mean, we know what they have in Brock Bowers, to a lesser extent, Mayer, but I'm not so sure when you look at some of these other guys.
The world is their oyster the rest of the way.
Oh, my gosh. They're going to get another receiver. They're going to get a running back. Quarterback. I mean, I would imagine that they're making a lot of changes, would be my guess. More changes that we're talking about here on this show include the Texans. Maybe the most interesting one here, John, that the Houston Texans, a year ago, Bobby Slowick was getting all kinds of head coaching interviews. This year, he gets let go. And they bring in Nick Caley. Now, I kind of thought, maybe you and I already talked about this, I kind of thought they would bring in a guy that had some experience because DeMeco Ryans is the D coordinator and the head coach. So he's very involved on the defensive side of the ball. So I guess I kind of thought, man, they'll probably need an OC that really has experience. It's not the route he went. He went with Nick Caley. What do we know about Caley, John?
We know he went with Nick Caley because both he and Nick Caserio graduated from Johns Hopkins University and also overlap with the Patriots. That's where Caley first started as New England's tight ends coach in 2017, which, by the way, that was the last year that Rob Gronkowski had an 1,000-yard season. But more importantly, in terms of what he's bringing to the Texans offense, Caley was Sean McVay's tight ends coach the past 2 years with the Rams. And I would imagine that's the kind of scheme and tree he's bringing over. What haunted Houston in their 2 seasons under former OC Bobby Slowick is that he consistently set their offense up for failure and running too often on early downs and averaging 3rd and 7.5 yards to go in that time. Whereas, think about it. In 4 seasons with Matthew Stafford, McVay not once allowed his offense to average even 7 yards to go on money downs. That's not how you play consistent football. Yes, C.J. Stroud bailed Slowick out as a rookie because C.J. Stroud is that good at professional football. But obviously, you can't live in that kind of zone to where you're consistently asking your quarterback to make miracles on 3rd down. You still have to make life easier for him. And so I would hope Caley brings that mentality and play calling to the Texans, which obviously will help elevate Stroud and Nico Collins in particular even more this year.
Yeah, that'll be interesting because they got a lot of guys that, could put up big numbers depending on what Caley does. The Rams have that history of just riding one running back. You would think that that's good news for Joe Mixon, right?
Absolutely. And Joe Mixon, as we saw last year, yes, his floor was very low whenever he had bad games, but in his first 6 games was an RB1 top 12 running back in every single one. Like, he showed he also has a high ceiling. And so now implementing not just fullback usage as Slowick did, but also expanding the offense even more for Mixon, I think that helps. I also think Dalton Schultz is an interesting player to watch here, assuming he's back with the Texans this year, because in not only helping Gronkowski, and honestly, we know Gronkowski was going to be an amazing tight end no matter who his tight ends coach was, but not only in working with Gronkowski and assisting Tyler Higbee under McVay, we now get Caley working with Dalton Schultz as the only and primary receiving tight end there. Tank Dell will likely be out at least the first month of the season or be put on PUP list as he recovers from his unfortunate injury, and Robert Woods is also a free agent. So there's lots of targets to go around there that I think could go to Schultz, as we saw Schultz was actually an important part of that offense and helping them move the ball over the last month of the season.
Interesting AFC news out of the Combine, in particular sticking in the AFC South. Chris Ballard, the Colts GM, was very clear that they're going to bring in another quarterback to compete with Anthony Richardson and that it will be an open competition. I'm just curious to think who that could be, John, and what would end up happening there.
I'm not sure because as we saw last year and talked about on every weekly show, Joe Flacco, who they brought in, his consistency really came down to whether or not the pocket could get crushed by the opposing defense. If Flacco was left upright, then he was going to have a great fantasy day. If we knew it was a team that could get pressure on him, we knew he was going to have a bad fantasy day. It was that easy. But for Anthony Richardson, whenever he came back in for Joe Flacco, and not just in terms of fantasy points, he did enough, even throwing the ball downfield more consistently, that I do think it's an odd statement to already practically bail on your very young quarterback. I don't think there are enough options in both this draft and free agency who could actually compete with Anthony Richardson. So I am still personally drafting Richardson in early best ball as a player who's going to start the year. But is it a volatile pick? Yes. I would just think that Richardson still wins this competition just because of the pool of players that are available out there and is still the better option right now.
So very much looking forward to next week. We'll do kind of a free agency preview of sorts with so many of the skill guys that are available before the free agent period starts the following Wednesday. Check him out on social always at NotJDaigle. I told you about the code FEAST at EstablishTheRun.com. I'm at Ross Tucker NFL. Love those of you that rate and review the show. It means a great deal. Other than that, I'm stuffed. We're done.
Thanks for tuning in to Fantasy Feast. Make sure to also check out the Ross Tucker Football Podcast, Even Money, and College Draft, all on the DraftKings Network, YouTube, or subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform.